So I'm Bill Bernett. I'm the president of Parental Alienation Study Group. I work at Vanderbilt University. I'm a professor emeritus at Vanderbilt. And I'm really happy to be able to make this introductory, welcoming presentation here at the third international conference of the Parental Alienation Study Group. So you can see what my talk is called about how did we get here and where are we headed. So that conveys a little bit of the big picture of what is the world of parental alienation and how did we get to be where we're at today. And this is what generally I'm going to try to cover in the next 45 minutes. I'm going to talk about diversity and what we do with that. I'm going to talk about how we engage in debate and both agreement and disagreement and how we try to come to consensus. I'm going to talk about the aspect of diversity that we ourselves come from a variety of backgrounds that we think is really valuable. And I'm going to talk about the future. So let's talk about diversity. What I mean by that, I hope in the process of going through these that you actually learn something about parental alienation. In other words, I'm trying to convey the values of our organization of PASG and that these values are going to play out in the next 3 days, that they're not just abstract values, but we can actually put them in practice at this meeting. And one of these values is diversity. And what I mean by that is that the entire scholarship of parental alienation has a background over the years in a number of different roots, in a number of different places. And here's an interesting starting point of a book that was published in the 1940s by this guy named David Levy, who was a child analyst in New York City doing research. And he wrote this book about overprotection. And here's one of the sentences, just look at the second sentence, where he's describing how the child has a derogatory aspect toward the father, which was in several instances fostered by the mother, thereby reducing the paternal influence down to its lowest degree. So that sounds familiar, doesn't it? Isn't that what happens in cases of parental alienation? This book was published in the 1940s by somebody who, of course, never even heard of parental alienation. But he's describing how this phenomenon occurred in intact families. Now, this is a little trivia point for those of you who like trivia. So this is a book by a psychiatrist named David Levy. There are actually, in the history of parental alienation, 2 David Levys. And you're going to hear about the other one later, on Saturday. But just for your information, in case you don't want to get confused, there are 2 of them in the history of this of parental alienation. So I'm going to give you several examples of the roots, the historical roots of alienation. David Levy is one in the 1940s. Here's one from the 1960s. This is a psychiatrist named Murray Bowen, who had a theory of family relationships, and he introduced the idea of triangulation. And this is a little example of triangulation. We don't need to go into the details, but there's conflict in this family between dad and mom, and the child connects with one parent and has discord with the other parent. And this is Murray Bowen's idea that he published in the 1960s. I actually knew this guy a little bit. I used to work in a hospital that was next door to his clinic. And so sometimes I would go over and listen to what he had to say. So he's an example of somebody in the history of family therapy from the 1960s. And like I said, his concept was called triangulation. In fact, if you just look at part of this quote, there's a pattern in which the mother, in an over-adequate position to the child, has the so-called custody of the child, while the father is left out. So that's another person who's describing this phenomenon before the name parental alienation was ever known to anybody. So here's another person in the history of this concept named Salvador Minuchin. And he was published mainly in the 1970s. I'm going, chronologically as much as I can here. And Minuchin also had a concept that we know about today, which was cross-generational coalition. And in what he says, one of the parents joins the child in a cross-generational coalition against the other parent. So these people don't just exist in the abstract. Salvador Minuchin is actually the mentor of people in this room. There are people here who knew him and were tutored by him. And so these historical figures have percolated down to our own face-to-face understanding of parental alienation. I'm trying to give you a historical diversity, okay? And what, in case it isn't obvious, what I'm trying to show you is that even though Richard Gardner was really important in the history of this concept, that he isn't the only person. In other words, it's really fallacious to criticize parental alienation by saying Richard Gardner was off base and didn't know what he was talking about, because it doesn't just come from him. It is true that the phrase parental alienation syndrome was invented, in a sense, by Gardner, and this was his really famous article published in 1985 in which he introduced that term. But I guess what I'm trying to convey is that our history is not just from Gardner, it's from a number of different sources. And this is Gardner's official definition of the syndrome: a disturbance in which children are obsessed with deprecation and criticism of a parent, denigration that is unjustified or exaggerated. So I think we're all kind of familiar with that phrase. And of course, we still live with that phrase today. But he's just one of many ancestors to our current situation. There's another really important ancestor, which are Stanley Clower and Bryn Brivlin, who are a sociologist and a social worker who wrote these books. Children Held Hostage. This is the original edition, and then this was the edition a few years ago, the second edition. So just let me give you an example of what they said. Yeah, they're the people who use the phrases programming and brainwashing, and they had definitions of programming and they had definitions of brainwashing, and they had many, many examples. They had a study that involved 1,000 children from maybe 800 families over the years, in which they developed many, many examples of alienating behaviors and symptoms in the children. And their work was about the same time as Gardner's work, and eventually they got to know each other, and in their work they do refer to Gardner. But these books that they did were very important. Do you remember what they were? Right here. They're very important. Do you know why? Because these books were promoted or commissioned, I guess is the word, by a component of the American Bar Association. These books didn't just show up, but the family law section of the American Bar Association contacted Clower and Rivlin and asked them to publish this study. So this is a huge study that was commissioned and endorsed, as much as you can say, by the American Bar Association. That's really important. In case you're interested, Clower and Rivlin actually live near here. They live in Philadelphia. And we invited them to be here today, but they weren't able to. They had some other issues going on that they were not able to be here. So I'm trying to give you diversity. Let me tell you about one more person. You might know about Barry Bricklin. Kind of coincidentally, Dr. Bricklin is a psychologist who also lives here in Philadelphia. And we also invited him to be here today, but he has some medical issues, and he sent his regrets. But he said to say hi to everybody. So he is a fellow who developed some tests that can be used in the diagnosis and the assessment of parental alienation. And one is called the Bricklin Perceptual Scale. I'm not going to tell you exactly how these things work, but it's a fairly good way to identify situations in which the child totally relates to one parent and totally rejects the other parent. And you can sort of do this quantitatively. And he also had this, he liked to make up phrases, and he had this phrase called NBOAI, which stands for not based on actual interaction. And there, you understand what that means. The child has a relationship with a rejected parent that is not based on the child's actual interaction with that parent, but is based on indoctrination. So this is another person who is part of our history and who has contributed to this concept. Now, not everybody agrees with these people. I mean, there are people here who don't agree with Dr. Bricklin or his methods. And so don't expect, just because I'm mentioning these people as part of our history, that everybody agrees with all these people, which is fine. We have different points of view. Okay, here's another person in our history, which almost everybody has heard of, which is Richard Warshak and his book called Divorce Poison. His book, which almost everybody has purchased and read, I bet, is the most widely read book in the world regarding parental alienation. And it's been republished and translated in a number of different ways. This down here, if you can see that, are editions that are published in Czech, the Czechian language, Croatian language, Finnish, Korean, and Japanese. And there's actually another one. He sent me a note a couple of days ago. There's another one. I forget the country. So anyway, he's a good example of making a contribution to this science, but in one more thread, although it's a pretty important thread. He was also sorry he couldn't be here. Actually, we were hoping that Dr. Warshak would be here today. And in fact, he was in our original advertising for this conference, he was actually mentioned, but later he had some personal situations and wasn't able to be here. But so we miss him. This is just a quote from his book. So let me mention a few other threads in our history. So there's a really famous article here. What happened was, after Richard Gardner's publications became well known, there are some people who objected to certain things Gardner did and said. And Joan Kelly and Janet Johnson are an example, and they wrote what was called, famous article, called the Reformulation article, Reformulation of Parental Alienation Syndrome, in which they felt that Gardner put too much emphasis on the alienating parent, and that they felt there should be more emphasis on the child, which is okay, whatever. But, they're not everything they say. We don't really agree, at least I don't, with everything they say, but I do agree with some of it. And I'll give you an example. This is their definition of the alienated child, and this sounds exactly what you think an alienated child sounds like. Defined as one who expresses freely and persistently unreasonable negative feelings and beliefs, anger, hatred, rejection, toward a parent, and that these feelings are significantly disproportionate to the child's actual experience with that parent. So that's our definition. And, there's been a little bit of hard feelings. There's some people feel that they created a schism into different believers in parental alienation, and that it's been unfortunate that that has happened. But in any case, my point is, that the scholarship in this field has many different sources, and we can find all these sources helpful in one way or another. So I'm going to give you another example of a source of our scholarship, but that we don't agree with all of it. And this is Craig Childress. You know, this is Craig's book. His idea is attachment-based parental alienation, ABPA, and his book. And he does an interesting thing. This is his definition. And this sounds somewhat familiar. ABPA refers to the child's triangulation into the spousal conflicts of the formation of a cross-generational coalition with a narcissistic or borderline parent. You know, and I think that actually is correct in some cases. I don't think his definition applies to every single case of parental alienation or severe parental alienation, but I'm sure it sounds like to me it applies to some. But you know, take a look at what he's done here. He starts out with kind of a definition, and what he does is exactly what I talked about earlier that we do, that his concept refers to the child's triangulation, and that's Murray Bowen that I've already mentioned to you. And the next phrase in his definition is the cross-generational coalition, which is what Salvador Minuchin said. And this thing about borderline people is a guy named Otto Kernberg. So, you know, Craig Childress is doing the same thing that we do. In other words, he's drawing on a variety of historical figures to create his way of thinking about this condition. So, well, a consequence of this diversity that I'm talking about is that we do end up with different opinions about some things. And what do? We discuss it, we debate it. I'm going to get to how we try to arrive at consensus. But let me, for the moment, let's just tell you about some of the debates. And I'm trying to convey to you that the people here this week, we don't agree on everything. And don't expect us to. And you're going to hear presentations in which in the morning somebody says a certain thing, and in the afternoon somebody else might say something slightly different. So don't get aggravated, don't get confused if you notice that. That's fine. I think we all agree on the basics, but there are a number of things that we might disagree on. And I want to give you some examples so you know concretely what I'm talking about. Here's the basic definition. Is there anything here that people might disagree about? A child whose parents are engaged in a high conflict separation divorce allies strongly with one parent and rejects the other one. So believe it or not, this is actually a source of disagreement, that some people don't feel that we should have this phrase, high conflict separation or divorce, in this definition. Do you all know why? Because this phrase implies that the high conflict is created by both parents. In other words, it suggests that both the mom and the dad are contributing to the conflict, and their joint behavior causes alienation. And people say, well, that's not a good assumption, because generally in these cases, one parent is actually causing the problem and the other parent is kind of the victim. I think we all understand that, and I think we all agree on that. But there's a concern about even phrases like this in the definition. So here's another one. We use the words parental alienation. Now, believe it or not, people disagree on what those words mean. And maybe you're aware of this, but let me tell you, and when I tell you, you're going to say, oh yes, you are aware of it. People have at least two different meanings. And so first of all, some people feel that it refers to the actions, that the phrase parental alienation refers to the actions of the alienating parent. In other words, suppose it's the mom, that parental alienation refers to what the mom is doing. So does it refer to that, or does it refer to the result of those actions? In other words, the child's rejection of the targeted parent. You follow me? In other words, there are two different components here. Or does it refer to both together? In other words, right here, this yellow squiggle, some people say that the word parental alienation refers to the child's rejection of this parent, the alienated parent, and other people say that the words parental alienation refer to what's happening over here, that it's the alienating behaviors of this parent. Now, you might say, so what? Well, if you're obsessive, yeah, you would be aware that this fuzziness creates problems in discourse. And if you publish a paper saying this is a study of parental alienation, what's the paper about? Is the paper about alienating behaviors, or is it about the child rejection? Or furthermore, if you publish a paper in which you say this is the prevalence of parental alienation in our society or in our country, what are you talking about? Are you talking about how many people, how many parents experience alienating behaviors, or are you talking about how many children end up being alienated? So I'm just giving you this as an example. Even among all of our friends here, people use basic words in somewhat different ways. So I'll give you another example. This one is, you thought that one was interesting. Excuse me. So this one's slightly more complicated. So think in your mind, what is the cause of this condition? Where does it come from? Who causes it? How is it created? So here's one example to say that alienation is caused by the indoctrination of the child by the other parent. The indoctrination of the child to reject and so on the relationship with the other parent. In other words, it's caused by persistent indoctrination or brainwashing. So here's an interesting question. Is it possible to end up with alienation in the child, the syndrome in the child, without the bad acts of the alienating parent? And that's an interesting question, and there's some disagreement about that. I don't think we're going to solve that this week, but I'm just using that as an example that comes up in research on this topic. Okay, I'm giving you a number of examples of things that we might disagree on. Here's another one. So when you start talking about this, especially in a clinical situation, the question arises, what's the difference between mild, moderate, and severe cases of parental alienation? You know, that may seem obvious, but many people have never gotten around to addressing this. And a couple months ago, I was reading about one of the interventions by some people, not anybody here, but it's this program in Boston. And it's a good, I guess it's a good program. I think it's helpful to some people. And I wrote to them and I said, hey, I enjoyed reading about your program, but who's it for? Who's it intended for? Is it intended for mild cases or moderate or severe cases of parental alienation, since that matters? And they wrote back and they said, well, we don't have definitions. We don't have enough information to define those terms. And I thought that was nutty, that how can you run a program without being able to just define who's it good for? And so we've developed what I think are simple definitions, which is mild. It means the child says, I don't want to go see daddy, but the child goes and does fine. Moderate, in general, means the child says, I don't want to go see daddy, but the child goes and does not do fine, is very oppositional during all that time. And severe is the child says, I don't want to go see daddy, and doesn't go. And daddy doesn't see the child for years. So that's one simple way to distinguish mild, moderate, severe. You have to kind of tweak those definitions a bit to actually work in practice. But why does that matter? Because in general, the interventions depend on your assessment of the severity. And just as a general rule, if it's mild, some therapists and judges simply treat that by admonishing the parents to shape up. They tell the parents, stop doing what you're doing. You know, both of you should have a relationship with the children and so on, so stop doing so much gatekeeping. In moderate cases might be, the intervention might be to have family therapy for everybody, involve both parents, you know, but both parents have to be willing to participate and, you know, have a total maybe a parent coordinator. You know, there are different ways of doing this. But really severe cases, I think you all realize, don't respond to traditional therapy. Really, really severe cases, almost always you have to remove the child from the home that's causing the parental alienation, because we consider that abusive. So my point is simply that it's really important for us to try to figure out general, sensible definitions for mild, moderate, and severe. That's going to come up later in the next couple of days. So I'm trying to give you a little overview here that pertains not just to this field in general, but pertains to this week, what's going to happen this week. So what else? Okay, so here's a good one. What does it take? What are the criteria to diagnose, to make the diagnosis of parental alienation? And there are different opinions about this. And I'll give you a fairly simple example. There is a model that was published a year or so ago called the 4-factor model, and it's a perfectly good model. And these are the 4 factors. Oh, well, actually, then there's another model called the 5-factor model. And these 2 factors are actually promoted by people in this room. That some of us have promoted the 4-factor model and some of us have promoted the 5-factor model, and that's okay. It's slightly different, you know, it deserves discussion. But let me tell you the difference. The 4-factor model involves, these are the 4 factors, that there's a prior positive bond between the child and the rejected parent. So in other words, in the past, suppose it's the dad who's alienated, that you can show that in the past, the dad and the child had a good relationship. Secondly, there's absence of abuse or neglect. So if it's the dad, you can show that there's no history, no evidence that the dad did anything to justify being alienated. Here's another one. The alienating behaviors are manifested by the preferred parent. So those are the 17 common alienating behaviors that Dr. Amy Baker has described in her research. And the 4th factor, of course, is there's the presence of the 8 behavioral manifestations in the child. And those, of course, are the common, well-known 8 symptoms of parental alienation that Richard Gardner originally described in 1985. So that's very straightforward. That's the 4-factor model. So if that's so simple, well, why do we need a 5-factor model? Because we add one more factor to say, in the very beginning, a very basic issue, that the child actually avoids or rejects a relationship with one of the parents. So that seems obvious that that's part of the definition of parental alienation. So I don't want to get into a discussion right now whether the 5-factor model or the 4-factor model should be adopted. I'm just trying to give you this as an example of that even people who work together and so on don't have to agree on absolutely everything, and it's okay to have some discussion of these differences. Okay, here's another thing that there might be some disagreement, and it has to do with shared parenting. You know, I guess the basic definition of shared parenting is that the court will say that custody is going to be shared by the mom and the dad, and perhaps it's 50-50. Perhaps it's 1 week with the mom and 1 week with the dad, or something close to that. So there's a lot of people who feel that shared parenting is so good and so helpful that that should be the presumption in cases of divorce and if there's some custody dispute. Well, not everybody agrees with that. That's what I just said, that a lot of people here would say that that should be the default arrangement. But other people don't like it. Because why? they feel that if you have the child 50-50, that you're actually going to aggravate the situation and you're going to cause parental alienation. And furthermore, there's another way to think about it, is suppose parental alienation is already present in the family. You don't want to have shared parenting because the child goes back and forth and the child is going to be subjected to even more brainwashing. So anyway, I'm just trying to use this as an example that the discussion of shared parenting is complex and that not everybody agrees on that. I hope everybody's getting the message here that not everybody agrees on everything. And so what we try to do is we try to listen to each other and we try to see if there's some consensus. And we're going to try to do that this week. I mean, there's a number of opportunities in the next couple of days to discuss these differences and see if we can agree on some consensus on some of these points. As an example of consensus, I'll go back to this, the basic definition that I put up before, which probably you've seen many times, of parental alienation. And actually, some people would say, well, in fact, almost everybody agrees with that definition. And you might be aware that there was a survey taken a few years ago at a meeting of the AFCC, Association of Family Conciliation Courts, and it was a big meeting, and the people who were at the meeting filled out a questionnaire, and Dr. Baker and some other people analyzed the results of that questionnaire. And this was really important, that they asked this question: do you think that some children are manipulated by one parent to irrationally and unjustifiably reject the other parent? Well, that's a paraphrase of parental alienation. And we knew, we thought that almost everybody would agree with that, but 98% of the people in the room who responded to the questionnaire, 300 people, said yes. So what's the significance of that? Sometimes in court, we're challenged, and the other side says there's not agreement, that the professional community doesn't even agree that parental alienation happens. And this is a really good survey of people in the professional community, including attorneys and judges and social workers and psychologists, and 98% of them agree. It's a really good evidence that this concept is generally accepted by this community. So that's an example that even though there's disagreements on the details, there appears to be agreement on the central ideas. So what does it take to accomplish consensus? We need research, and we need discussion. We need to listen to each other and see, well, why do we have slightly different opinions? And we can't just try to achieve consensus just by being opinionated. That, you really need to have data. You need to have some reason to convince other people that you're saying the right thing. So that's something we hope to accomplish somewhat in the next couple of days. Most of us do agree on basic principles. So I want to mention a few names. We're going to be pretty blunt about some of the things that happen, that even though most of us agree on the basic definition and so on, there are some people who I would call soft skeptics. And I already mentioned earlier, a few minutes ago, Janet Johnston, who has a somewhat different way of looking, a different emphasis. And, she agrees with the basic phenomenon, but she wants to put the emphasis differently. And so she's not completely on the same page. And I think Craig Childress is a good example of that also, that he keeps saying that he doesn't want to call it a parental alienation, and he puts it in quotation marks, so-called parental alienation, but he agrees with the basic concept, but he disagrees on a lot of details. So I guess I would call him a soft skeptic. I don't worry too much about them. They're basically going in the same direction as we are. But there are a few people who write articles and who give speeches and who make videos and who testify who totally disagree with what we do. And I'm going to tell you who they are. They're Joanna Silberg, who's a psychologist in Baltimore. There's Robert Geffner, who's a psychologist. Joan Mayer is an attorney in Washington, D.C. Richard Ducote, I think, is an attorney in Louisiana. And I think Kathleen Russell is simply a child advocate, I think, in California. And none of this is a secret. In other words, I'm not telling you stuff that somehow is confidential. These are all people who have gone public. Some of them have their own websites in which they talk about parental alienation being a fraud or a hoax. But these people are the people who are actively saying, sometimes they say there's simply no such thing. They say that parental alienation was invented by Richard Gardner and is basically a hoax or something like that. And they testify in court in one way or another. They interfere, I think, with the judicial process by making false claims at times in court. And so these are people who I really would call hard skeptics. Well, I've been talking about the general field. Let's talk a bit about Parental Alienation Study Group and how do we fit into this. So we're the believer in the big tent. And the idea is that we welcome people who basically believe generally what we believe. We welcome diversity. We welcome different opinions. You're going to hear that this week. We're really interested in the big tent in people from a variety of backgrounds. In other words, I think we're actually somewhat unusual for an advocacy organization. We're not totally unusual. There are other organizations. The Mental Health Association of America, I think, does the same thing, in that they welcome parents and professionals. But, we have parents, we have legal people, adult children of parental alienation, researchers, and so on. And we think that that strengthens us as being part of a big tent because we hear opinions from different people. Well, I got to tell you, we don't welcome everybody. In other words, there are some people in this world who are simply unpleasant and who don't really want to collaborate. Really, all they want to do is argue. And I'll just tell you that those people we really don't welcome, even though we welcome almost everybody in PASG. There are a few people who simply want to argue that we don't welcome. So here we are at this meeting. So we think that the meeting itself expresses the values that I've been talking about here for the last 30 minutes. And that we think that at this meeting you're going to hear a diversity of opinion. You're going to hear a good deal of discussion and debate. We hope there's going to be some consensus from the different people who are here. So let's talk a little bit about the future. So we have a lot of ideas about what should happen in the future. So here's a very common idea, that there should be more education of mental health professionals, like trainees, psychologists and social workers and so on. We should be out there educating them at the very beginning of their education about this. So what about that? Well, we're doing that. There's actually a program in Louisiana called Better Options, and they've actually created a curriculum that is being used this year for graduate students in counseling programs. So there are actually people out there, members of this organization, who are creating ways to educate professionals. Here's another idea for the future. We should educate child protection workers that this is a form of child abuse. Don't you think that's a good idea? Well, we're doing that. At least we're trying to. One of our members, Ron Berglass, is in California, and he's actually met with members of the California Assembly to try to get them to adopt this idea that psychological child abuse should be part of the training of child protection workers, including alienation. Here's another idea for the future, that the whole thing about family law should not be so adversarial. It should be mediation. I mean, a lot of people think that's kind of an idea, but it's maybe hard to achieve. Well, we're doing that. One of our members is an attorney and a scholar in Washington, D.C., named Dana Richard, and he's promoting that. He's done research on it and is writing articles about that exact thing. Here's more and more thing to the future. And this has to do with the mild, moderate, severe, is that everybody should try to identify cases that are mild and do something about it before they become severe. Doesn't that sound like a good idea? Well, some of us are doing that. There's our colleagues, Christine Turner and Mary Alvarez, who are here in this room, who are in Houston, Texas, and they're doing research on how do you identify children and families mild, and what can you do about it. So here's just one more thing. Basic counterintuitive feature of this is that abused children still want to hang out with their abusive parent, while alienated children reject the non-abusive parent. That's hard, that's counterintuitive. So what are we doing about that? Well, there's research that, first of all, Dr. Baker has done research on the idea, in fact, this is her book, Bonded to the Abuser, and the entire study has to do with the fact that abused children still want to be with the parent who's been abusive to them. And then I've done some research on the opposite, on the idea that children who are alienated absolutely reject the parent who has not been abusive. So those are two different handles on that counterintuitive thing. And I'm not going to explain this whole thing, but over here are the kids who were alienated. These are the kids who were not alienated. And there's a test. There's a test that we use that totally separated these kids from these kids, except for this one person. So this test is 99% successful. So anyway, I wanted to give you the big picture. What do we believe in? What are our values? What do we think should happen? A few of you, many of you actually, are not members of this organization, so we welcome you to join. And I appreciate your attendance and also your attention this morning.